Hello everybody and welcome back to Ancient Texts. I'm your host, Jeremy Richard, and today we're going to take a break from the history of the ancient text to tackle one of the most controversial issues of the last several hundred years, and that issue is Calvinism. If you're like me, once you become a believer at some point you were introduced to the concept of predestination and Calvinism, and then you started doing a bit of research on the topic. At first, it appears to be a logically complex topic that involves destiny and whether or not God chooses those that will be saved, thus appearing to negate free will, while the opponents of Calvinism try to argue for free will while appearing to negate predestination. The bad news is that those arguments are fairly long, complex, and it takes a bit of time to really nug down into them to understand them. I've spent the better part of 30 years studying all the views, and for most of my life I've held kind of a spork view of Calvinism, where some of Calvinism is true and some of Calvinism is false. But either way I leaned, there was always, but what about this verse, that Calvinists would bring up that seemed to make sense, so I had to concede that at least some of their beliefs were true. But all that changed a couple of years ago for reasons that I'll get into in just a minute. The good news is that today I'm going to present a view in just a few minutes that will completely eliminate the need for those complex arguments. This is the last video that you will ever need to understand why Calvinism is false with 100% certainty. So what is Calvinism? It is a belief system named after John Calvin, who is one of the primary champions of the idea. Keep in mind that John Calvin was not a good man and burned people at the stake for not adhering to his opinions on biblical doctrine. Calvinism is based on five main points called TULIP: total depravity, unconditional election, limited atonement, irresistible grace, and perseverance of the saints. The general thesis is that only God chooses who will be saved, called the elect, and those elect are predestined from before the beginning of the world for salvation. They must have their hearts transformed by God through a process called regeneration before they can be saved. If you aren't elect, you are out of luck and doomed to rot in hell for all eternity. Now, to be fair, not all Calvinists believe exactly that. Obviously, this view has some inherent problems that people have issues with. It isn't very fair for God to pick and choose who goes to heaven, many argue, so some Calvinists will drop some of the main beliefs and are only quote-unquote 4-point Calvinists or 3.5 Calvinists, because they think that there is such a thing as predestination and that you can have free will. This debate has raged for centuries, and Calvinism in its entirety can be debunked at every turn. But again, those arguments get into the theological nitty-gritty. Today, we aren't going to do that so much. While you can still use those advanced arguments, the goal of this video is to eliminate them altogether. Remember that Calvinists only try to proselytize Christians, and when they do, they use what I call the bridge deck of arguments. These are all the verses that they cite and the reasons why they think those verses support their thesis. Verses like, "You did not choose me, I chose you," "No one can come to me unless the Father who sent me draws him," "He predestined us for adoption as sons through Jesus," "For those whom he foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son," and "Except those days be shortened, there should no flesh be saved, but for the elect's sake those days will be shortened." Those are some sample verses that Calvinists will hit you with, and when you try to rebut one, they won't actually address the point you just made. They'll just flip to another one of these verses, and you'll rebut that, and they won't address that either. They'll just move on to another one, so on and so forth. When I ask these opponents why they keep moving to other verses, they'll simply say that they are giving me, quote, the whole counsel of God, unquote. That way they never have to defend an individual verse and point. They simply keep moving to other points that they think supports their thesis. Now, to be absolutely clear, my opponents who are Calvinists are some of the smartest guys around. Most have advanced theology degrees and almost all of them are brilliant at logic. Seitan Bruggencate is one Calvinist that I debated quite extensively. He's absolutely spot on in his logical analysis of every subject except Calvinism. Him and the others I've debated with are quite blind to their own logical fallacies that they would normally have no problem spotting. But let not your heart be troubled. We don't actually need to refute these verses. But since the verses are there, I will tell you exactly why none of them support Calvinism. And by the end of this video, you will probably be able to spot why for most of them yourself. I do want to spend a special amount of time on one of the verses, "You did not choose me, I chose you," to demonstrate that they can be individually countered with a more detailed understanding of the ancient text and the Jewish culture. But I'll put that at the end of the video, and that'll just be lagniappe if you want to watch it. Back to the bridge deck. Remember, the deck represents all of the arguments that Calvinists will use to support their thesis. What we're going to do today is focus on the towers, and without these towers, the bridge deck cannot exist. The three towers we're going to destroy in this video are predestination, the elect, and regeneration. Calvinism needs all three of these to support their bridge. If we tore down only one, we would destroy their bridge. But we are going to tear down all three, and the way we're going to do that is by demonstrating that Calvinists are quite simply using the wrong definitions of words. It really is that simple. But the brilliance of Calvinism is that they get us to use their definitions of those words when we argue with them. And that is a frustrating prospect, if not impossible. First, we have predestination. God alone chooses or elects who will be saved. R.C. Sproul said, "The Calvinist view of predestination teaches that God actively intervenes in the lives of the elect to make absolutely sure that they are saved." The elect. Unconditional election is considered one of the aspects of predestination where God chooses certain individuals to be saved. Regeneration. R.C. Sproul. In regeneration, God changes our hearts. He gives us a new disposition, a new inclination. That is why we said earlier, regeneration precedes faith. I also want to point out that in the definition of the elect, it says, and I quote, "Unconditional election is essentially related to the tulip doctrinal outline." End quote. If you don't have the elect as a tower, you don't have the bridge, even by their own definition. But before we go further, we need to have an understanding of three definitions from the ancient texts that Calvinists will 100% agree with so that we all know what we're talking about. The first is justification. That is the point in time on earth when one is born again or saved. This is a one-time event. Glorification. The point in time during our transition from earth to heaven where each believer gets a new body. This is a one-time event for all believers. The rule of first mention. The principle that requires one to go to the portion of Scripture where a concept is first mentioned to get the meaning of that concept. So, with those definitions in mind, and without further gilding the lily, let's get the sledgehammers out. The first, and probably the most important tower, is predestination. It is mentioned in two passages in the New Testament, twice in Romans 8 and twice in Ephesians 1. Let's take a look. "For those whom he foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son, and he predestined us for adoption to himself through Jesus." The Calvinist definition of predestination is that only people who were chosen by God from before the foundation of the world will be justified. This concept is conflated with the elect or the chosen, and also conflated with destiny. Their position in the strictest form is that an individual doesn't have a choice about this justification. There is no free will. And when we argue with Calvinists about this topic, we unconsciously use their definition of the word to argue against their thesis. So you see the frustration that I had for many years. The problem with their view is that their definition of the word is wrong. The root word of predestination is not destiny, it is destination. In both instances in Romans and Ephesians, predestination is very specifically for glorification, not justification. You were never predestined to be justified. That is completely up to you if you believe in Jesus and take action on that belief. But once you are justified, you have a destination to get a glorified body in the future. Everyone who has been justified will be glorified. In Romans 8, being conformed to the image of the Son is quite clear. Jesus died, rose again, and he has a new body already. Remember, he could disappear and walk through walls. In Ephesians, Paul uses the word adoption. But what does that word mean? Paul defines adoption for you back in Romans 8:23, waiting for the adoption, to wit, the redemption of our body. Predestination is not a magical, mystical word about your destiny. When you input Walmart into your GPS device and you see a route to get there, that is a predestination. It is a destination which you have not yet arrived. It is not an inescapable destiny that you cannot change. We don't even need the rule of first mention here because we discussed both of the main passages where the word is used. Predestination is about glorification, not justification. It has nothing to do with soteriology. Next is the elect. Calvinist definition. These are all the people on earth whom God has chosen to be justified. Only the elect go to heaven. The word is soteriology through and through. As you can see, there's already heavy conflation of this definition with predestination. It really is difficult to see much of a difference between the two. If I'm elect, I'm predestined. If I'm predestined, I'm elect. The Calvinist definition seems to fit, more or less, in verses like Matthew 24:22. "And except those days should be shortened, there should no flesh be saved, but for the elect's sake those days shall be shortened." And also in Matthew 24:24, "For there shall arise false Christs and false prophets, and shall show many signs and wonders, insomuch that, if it were possible, they shall deceive the very elect." okay, well maybe verse 24 presents some obvious problems, but we don't even need to go there. The point here is that the word eklektos is an adjective. It is used to describe a subset of a larger group. Notice that Calvinists use the word as a noun when the entire New Testament it is used as an adjective. That should be your first warning flag. So what is the elect? The Bible defines the word for you, and using the rule of first mention, let's look at all of the times it is used in the Old Testament. The word mine elect is bakir, and it is a masculine noun. There are only two the elect in the entire Bible, Israel and Jesus. That's it. The word bakir appears 13 times in the Old Testament. Here are all the verses. Once it means Jesus. 12 times it means Israel. I find that particularly fascinating since we know there are 12 tribes of Israel, even in Revelation. What is absolutely clear is that the adjective in the New Testament is not the same concept as the noun in the Old Testament, yet Calvinists use it like a noun. Some of the adjectives in the New Testament do indeed describe Israel, but some describe angels. Some describe one particular individual, such as a lady. We know that many in Israel, though the elect, have died and gone to hell. We know that Jesus doesn't need justification. We know that angels don't need justification. Therefore, the elect has zero to do with justification in soteriology. This definition of the elect, Israel and Jesus, fits the New Testament nicely, such as Matthew 24. The days will be shortened for Israel's sake, since Israel is the focus of Matthew 24, Revelation, and Daniel 9. Regeneration. Calvinists define this using Titus 3:5 and Ezekiel 36. He saved us through the washing of regeneration, renewed us by his Spirit's work, and then in Ezekiel, I'm going to give you a new heart, and I'm going to give you a new spirit. They are attempting to shoehorn their definition of regeneration from Titus 3:5 into Ezekiel 36. In their view, somehow regeneration precedes faith, but somehow also means born again, so there's a problem with this definition. Just like predestination, regeneration has nothing to do with justification. It has to do with glorification. The Greek word for regeneration is palingenesia, and it is only used twice in the entire Bible. And your first flag should be that palingenesia isn't even used in Ezekiel 36, so why would a Calvinist use that to define the word? Now the main reason is because Ezekiel was written in Hebrew, so they're trying to use a verse written in a completely different language to support their thesis. But even in the Septuagint, which is the Old Testament translated into Greek 300 years before Jesus, the word palingenesia is not used. The word cardia is used, and it means, surprisingly, heart. So what does palingenesia mean? Let's use the rule of first mention. Remember, it is only used twice in the entire Bible, in Titus, but first in Matthew 19:28. When the Son of Man sits on his glorious throne of the renewed creation, you who have followed me will also sit on 12 thrones governing the 12 tribes of Israel. It is the creation being renewed, the earth, and the universe. So back to Titus. He saved us through the washing of regeneration. The form of the noun for regeneration is genitive, and its number is singular. In other words, it is possessive or has possession and is singular. Jesus is the one who is regenerated in this verse, singular genitive, not us, or it would be plural. He is the one who literally got a new body by Jesus rising from the dead and getting his glorified body. He saved us. Now, as we can see, palingenesia has nothing to do with justification in Matthew 19:28. It does have to do with glorification, specifically the new bodies we receive, which those 12 will have at this point, and the literal new heaven and the new earth. In the same manner, Titus 3 is not talking about justification. It is talking about glorification, as one day we will get a renewed body. Only half of the translations use the word regeneration anyway, but you can see that Calvinists clearly have the wrong definition of the word. Now, maybe there's a chance you're still not convinced on regeneration. So let's destroy the Calvinist argument that only God can regenerate your heart, and that regenerated heart is necessary for justification using Ezekiel 18:31. Stop yourselves from transgressing the deeds by which you've rebelled, and then make for yourselves a new heart and a new spirit. Why should you die, house of Israel? You can make a new heart. So ironically, Ezekiel himself sinks the Calvinist definition of the word while they were using Ezekiel to try to define the word in the first place, even though Ezekiel never used the word. And now back to our three towers. We've demonstrated that predestination has nothing to do with justification. It's about glorification. The elect has nothing to do with justification. It has to do with Israel and is not soteriological in nature. Regeneration has nothing to do with justification or your heart, but is also about glorification. So what we've done in this video is destroyed all three of the towers needed to support the bridge. You never have to argue with Calvinists again on their terms. Simply demonstrate why their definitions of the elect predestination and regeneration are wrong, and unless they can resolve those, which they can't even begin to go on to their usual arguments and talking points. Now let's go back and take a look at the verses I presented at the beginning, and I'll take one of those and completely dismantle it. So here's all the verses I mentioned, and I'm willing to bet you can easily spot the problem with 3 of them now that you've watched this video. Matthew 24 is about Israel. Romans 8 and Ephesians 1 are about glorification. And John 6 does say that no one can come to Jesus unless the Father draws him. But that was spoken at the beginning of Jesus' career. Right before he was publicly executed, he tells the disciples exactly how many men will be drawn to him. And that's all. But John 15:16 does seem to present a win for the Calvinists. It seems to support their unconditional election thesis. That would be correct if the statement were soteriological in nature and if Jesus is talking about justification. But he's not. So what is he talking about? To understand this statement, we need to dig into the ancient Jewish educational system. For Jews living in Jesus' day, there were 3 separate educational venues. The first was called Bet Sephar. At the age of 6 through 12, Jewish children began their formal education. Both boys and girls attended synagogue school and learned to read and write. The textbook was the Torah, and the goal was not just to read it, but to memorize the ancient texts. For the best of the best, the next educational opportunity was called Bet Midrash. Boys from age 13 to 15 who were deemed worthy to continue their educational pursuits went on to study and memorize the entire Tanakh, or Old Testament, as well as learning the family trade. Of those who finished Bet Midrash, again, only the best of the best were able to pursue the final educational leg, which was called Bet Talmud. This was the longest in duration and went from the age of 15 to 30. To participate, the person must be invited by a rabbi, and, if selected, he would begin a process of grooming that would lead to the potential of becoming a rabbi at age 30. And those who were chosen were referred to as Talmudim. They would literally follow in the dust of their rabbi, desiring to emulate him in all of his mannerisms. They would eat the same food in exactly the same way as their rabbi. They would go to sleep and awake the same way their rabbi did. And more importantly, they would learn to study the Torah and understand God the exact same way as their rabbi. There's a couple of issues to consider with Jesus' disciples here. First, they had all not been selected for Bet Talmud. They probably didn't even get to Bet Midrash. Remember, being called by a rabbi for this PhD training was the highest honor in Jewish society, and they had all been passed over it and were all working in their various trades. Then one day, a rabbi comes up and calls them. It wasn't that they simply recognized Jesus as God. They probably didn't. But they were called by a rabbi, and that's why they suddenly dropped everything they had to follow him. They had just been given a second chance to reach the pinnacle of Israeli society. The second issue is that rabbis were notorious for being tough on their students, and indeed they probably had to be. Remember, these Talmudim spent 15 years under the tutelage and did all of their chores. They were basically servants. The rabbis were not friends with their students. They were more like what we would think of as a coach. In this verse in John 15, Jesus is reminding them, his disciples, that the rabbi chose them, but not because of any salvation issue. He had just finished making the point that Jesus had flipped the relationship and did not consider them his servants, but his friends. The disciples understood that Jesus was flipping the entire paradigm on its head. But since Calvinists don't know any of that, they read soteriology into the text that isn't there. And that's really where Calvinists get everything wrong. They impute justification into the text where no justification exists, and they have to use the wrong definitions of words to achieve it. Each of their verses cited can be debunked just like the one I did in John 15:16. Some require you to go deep, most don't. Until next time, thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe to support the channel, and I'll see you on the next episode of Ancient Texts. Leave a comment below with suggestions of what other stories or topics you'd like to see covered in a future episode.